Welcome or welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by Archive. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Carlos Arnaiz, Principal at CAZA, that's CAZA, in Brooklyn, New York. Carlos is an architect, educator, writer, and urban design consultant. He is the founder of CAZA, co-founder of SURBA, S-U-R-B-A, and an adjunct assistant professor at Pratt Institute's Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design. His work spans large-scale mixed-use complexes and strategic sustainability plans for cities worldwide. He holds a master's degree with honors from Harvard GSD and a bachelor's degree magna cum laude from Williams College. The project we're talking about today is the Shore-side Nawin, N-A-W-I-N, in Nasugbu Bay, Philippines. Perched along the rugged cliffs of Batangas in the Philippines, the shore-side at Nawin redefines the relationship between land and sea through an architectural vision rooted in both topography and tradition. Conceived as a contemporary port town, the development transforms a once industrial shoreline into a beautiful, I might add, layered, walkable environment where hospitality, culture, and coastal ecology converge. I can promise you by the end of this interview, I really wanted to go visit this place. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today, I'm honored to have Carlos Arnaiz, Principal at CAZA in Brooklyn, New York. The project we're chatting about today is Nawin, and I forgot to ask you about that one, so hopefully I said that right, in Nasugbu Bay, Philippines. Carlos, welcome to Detailed. How are you?
Hi, great. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
I always start every interview with a little icebreaker question to get to know you a little bit. And so my question for you today is, if you could trade places with one notable person in history, who would it be and why?
I love that question. I think I would say Alexander von Humboldt, who was a German ecologist, explorer in the early 18th century. He traveled the world and wrote a lot about what he saw from primarily nature ecosystems. And he was one of the first, kind of at the same period as Charles Darwin, but he was one of the first scientists during that Enlightenment period to connect the dots between uh, ecozones, species, and to understand that everything is connected in the natural world. So I love his writings, his drawings. They've been a big inspiration for me. But I also, of course, have this wanderlust in terms of travel and this idea that he went to Peru and the Himalayas and little tropical islands in the Pacific and sort of understood that that all of these dynamic natural systems are affecting one another across different terrains. And his insights, I think, even today for ecologists, have been very influential. So I would love to have lived at that period and done traveled to some of those spots.
I have the same dose of wanderlust. And so I now have homework to do because I've never heard of him. So I'm going to go figuring out who he is after this interview.
Biography that was written on him, published, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago, by a female historian. Can't remember her name, but if you look Alexander von Humboldt biography, that will pop up. It got excellent reviews and it's such a good read. I would highly recommend it.
Well, I am going to be checking that out. I may have to email you for the spelling of his last name.
Okay.
So let's talk about this project. But first, your website says that CAZA is a quote. This is a little bit longer quote. Brooklyn-based design studio and think tank with offices in Manila, Philippines, Bogota, Colombia, and Lima, Peru. that creates concept driven environments, buildings, and urban plans. Explain to me exactly what that means.
That's a great question for two reasons. First, it goes straight to the heart of the matter. I think we use the word concept because we're interested in how our ideas of places affect our experience of those places and how those ideas can change and can be influenced by many factors. Of course, the physical design of those places, but also the forces that are taking place in society, economy, pressures in politics, and we're interested as architects in engaging in that conversation of how our physical and uh, interventions into places can shape in a positive way the concepts we have and therefore the way we act. So that's the first reason I think it goes to the heart of matter. The second is that our website, this is a little plug, is in the process. We've been working on a big update to the website. And in fact, next week at this time, we will have a brand new website. So please check back again. And I think we're still using that word, but it is a big reboot of our website that has been in the works for almost a year.
Well, I just gave myself away. Clearly, I do research beyond the information you send me because I was on the website. Like, no, I want to know more. Um, so let's talk about Nawin. First, I have, if I look over, it's not because I'm reading emails. I'm looking at the pictures of your project on my other screen. I want to go hang out at this place, just so you know. It looks amazing. Like I every time I look at the picture, I just like want to cry a little bit. I want to be there and not here. Give me a little background and history on this project. Who is the client and what are they looking to achieve?
That's a one of the first things I tell people about this project is you got to know who the client is because they have they brought to the project a very unique vision. And first of all, they're not one group, but they are really a consortium. It's a group of local uh, business people who have been involved in real estate and property development, but that's not their forte. They're in finance, they're in hospitality, they're in fact, pharmaceuticals. One of them is the owner of the largest privately held pharmaceutical company in Southeast Asia, with factories all throughout the region. So they're quite diversified, and because I think they work in different industries, they brought to the project a unique vision that wasn't um, what normal, I think, real estate developers would do. I it's probably not news to your listeners who are in the industry of architecture and design that real estate is a rather risk averse industry, and which means that they typically favor solutions that have worked previously. And for real estate developers to think outside of the box normally requires them to be very creative, maybe younger, maybe stupid, and they kind of go and because of all of those things mixed together, they do something innovative. In this case, these guys are not stupid, but they are out from other industries and said, why don't we do it this way? And so what they wanted to do was to create the first marina town with all the amenities and all the experiences that you would have in a marina town that you might see in the south of France or on the coast of Turkey or in the Caribbean. Um, but here in this archipelago of 7,000 islands in Philippines, which is interestingly enough doesn't have such a thing. I mean, if you look at the history of, the Philippines is of course a island, it's an archipelago with a population that's always had a relationship to water, fishing, farming, aquaculture. But their relationship to water has many times been industrial, has not really been recreational. It's been a place to work. So if you look at the traditional towns in the Philippines and you go to the coast, along the waters where they have the fishing boats. And the towns actually face inward. The towns don't really look to the water, because the water was where people went to work. And then when they left the ocean, they went in many times also to protect themselves from the storms, to be away from the water where they have surges and you have more unpredictable elements. So facing the water is kind of a new thing. It's a thing of the 21st century, thinking of it as a place of leisure, relaxation. That's something that's in a way, I, strangely enough, if you think, it hasn't ever been done. So this would be the first, and hopefully, it will also, it's coming at a time where the country has experienced, economic uplift. There's a greater middle class. There's greater ability to have time to relax and to uh, have disposable income. To use that income to maybe spend the weekend on the coast and with your family. So this is partly also responding to the change in the socioeconomic makeup of the country.
So, as you just said, and from what I can tell from the photos that I'm looking at, you're not just designing a building, which is a lot of my interviews is tell me about this one building. You are designing an entire town. Broadly, and we'll get into more detail, but broadly describe what are all the different I don't expect the entire list. This is not a small deal here, but what are some of the more notable different facilities that are being designed in this marina area?
Yeah, it's well, the word small is interesting because the whole project has considerable amount of land. I think that total is about 20 hectares, which is a lot along the coast, but it's being done in phases. And the first phase is quite compact and small. It's about less than 6 hectares. And I say compact because within those 6 hectares, we are designing a fully self-sustaining, uh, multifunctional town that has almost everything at a small, reduced, compact scale. So there's housing, different types of housing, villas, apartments, terrace housing. There's places to shop, so commerce. There's places to eat, different types of restaurants, more bars, more casual, more a little bit more of a formal place. There's also a club that doubles as a co-working space, so people can be there over the course of a week and help host meetings, host more like corporate events type thing. Um, there's more recreational amenities, of course, like you might imagine, pool club and joggings, and places to push a stroller if when you're with your family. And so the and the focus has been on making it pedestrian friendly and really trying to uh, diminish the scale and make it something that is humane in terms of human scale. By that, it means that you're not privileging machines, cars, or all the other machines that you might need to keep this place working, such as water treatment plants and generators, all of which we're designing, but those are all sort of being pushed so as far away from the area where the humans are as possible, to make it a place where it's about communing with nature and with water. And we spend a lot of time thinking about walkways and paths and places where you can sit near a tree and walk by a canal. So all of that sort of human-based infrastructure, at a very, very small scale, has been woven into what is big, but it's meant to feel small.
So this question wasn't on my list, but be forewarned, that's going to happen.
That's right.
Is this town more tourism based, or is this meant to be a community that people are largely going to be living there?
It's a very good question. It's meant to be a community at first. There are, in the second phases, hotels being planned. But this first phase that you see in the pictures, and this 6 hectares that I mentioned, that is really based around the marina, is really community driven. Of course, not the tourists can come, and maybe people who own apartments might put them on Airbnb and rent them out or something. But it's not driven towards tourism, which also is a big change and it's different. I mean, if you look at most of the water-based uh, developments that have been implemented and built in the Philippines in the last 5 years, primarily they're tourism oriented. They're geared towards foreigners who come, and of course, foreigners, whether you're Australian, American, or coming from Singapore or Hong Kong, looking in the Philippines as a beautiful tropical destination. So you go there for 3, 4 days and you're on holiday. This is a little different. This is really meant more as a community where people would come here, either live here or might be a second home. And once the vision that the owners have is, once it becomes a community destination, then tourists will want to see it. Just like uh, they were thinking of a lot of the famous marina towns along the Mediterranean, where maybe a place like Positano or in Italy, where it is a community, but then tourists go because you actually are drawn by the community. You're like, oh, this is a wonderful little town along the Greek coast or something. So that was sort of the logic.
So, not every architect, I've been in this business for a very long time, more years than I'm going to admit to. Not every architect gets the opportunity to do this level of urban planning and development. Uh, in my trolling of you on the internet, it appears you do a lot of it. How did you end up going down this path?
Uh, it started in school. I was, and actually, I didn't study architecture at first. I did philosophy and environmental science, and that got me into architecture through the back door. And I was interested in philosophy, hence the concepts we have about our places, and environmental science, hence like people like Alexander von Humboldt. I was interested in ecology and how those affect how we ultimately treat our planet. Um, and the because of that, when I got into architecture school, I was always curious about urban design and landscape. So, in fact, the school I went to had a landscape architecture program and had an urban design program. And although I had applied to the architecture school and I ended up getting a degree in architecture, I did spend like half my time looking into the landscape architecture and peering into the urban design and taking classes as much as I could in those two other faculties and departments. So I was really always interested in that. And then when I actually got out of school, my first few jobs were in urban design and in landscape architecture. I practiced in a landscape architecture office. In fact, I even taught landscape architecture for a bit, for a couple of years right out of school. So I always have uh, tried to keep those two interests alive. And when I when when we founded CAZA about now almost 18 years ago, I always knew I wanted to try to get into urban design and find work in that sphere. And you're right, it's not easy and it's not usual. Um, but I think successfully been able to cultivate those clients, and also from a leadership standpoint, most of the research that we do in the office in terms of the books we write and the white papers we publish have usually been in that domain of urban and landscape. So that also allows us to keep that flame sort of burning. Yeah.
Well, I love that answer because one of the things I do a fair amount of teaching and mentoring myself. And one of the things I tell young people in our industry all the time is don't pigeonhole yourself into one thing, because you can't be a good architect if you don't understand more about the rest of the team and how they work and what's important to them, whether it's one of the consultants or engineers, or whether it's things like construction or urban planning or landscape architecture. Every piece that you pick up from these other pools that you have to work with makes you a better architect. Uh,
Completely agree with you.
yeah. It just, I mean, I know you can't learn it all, but even a basic understanding of a lot of the other parts of, because the project's not going to happen without everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Mm-hmm.
can't work as effectively with
Mm-hmm.
everybody else on the project team if you have no clue, what it is they do and how they do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that answer. When you're designing an entire community like this, what are some of the, like right out of the chute, because I know this is coming in phases, what are some of the major or more critical areas that need to be addressed in the planning phase?
I would say three right off the bat. Number one, hydrology. So really how water moves on the site. Really important, especially a coastal project like this, especially a coastal project in an area in the world that receives what is called super typhoons, which are basically like super hurricanes. In fact, there's one that just grazed the northern part of the Philippines right now as we speak, 165 miles an hour winds type
I
thing. And
saw that. I
yeah,
saw
right.
that on the news.
Yeah, I mean this
Insane.
is serious, insane. These are and this is the reality of building here. So understanding how water moves, both from the land, but also from excuse me, from the ocean, but also from the land. In other words, from the front and from the back, because water moves in both directions, and you got to think about the flow of water, capturing, not capturing, moving, retaining all of that whole hydrological process. Number one. Number two, um, the the vegetative process or the vegetative assets. In other words, the green stuff that's on the site. That of course complements the blue. I call it blue green. But looking at existing trees, looking at native species that can be reintroduced, looking at how you can utilize riparian corridors. In other words, areas where you have ecologies that are in the kind of wetland zone to help stabilize certain edges and whole earth in ways that are softer rather than harder. So looking at just all of the green technologies for from the site planning perspective. And then the third is circulation and movement that has to do with and not just, of course, vehicles. I think most people think circulation is just moving cars, but it's not at all. And I think we got to think about the post-car world. Um, in fact, in this project, at one point, the client said, "We don't want any cars," uh, or at least there was one couple of clients of the consortium said, "We want no cars in the project." Of course, that it's like, well, how can we do that? Is that realistic? Is it all vehicles? And having this debate now 2025 seems early, but I think in 5 years this debate will be very, very serious in terms of automated vehicles, how much cars do you need, but also other forms of circulation. The widths of paths, bikes, walkers, pedestrians, smaller vehicles, if they're what we call automated vehicles, um, and how you plan them, how you move them, the difference between larger thoroughfares, smaller, where the service vehicles are. And a project like this, of course, has roads that are, or maybe access points that are just about getting the trash out or bringing utilities in and maintaining the project as opposed to arriving as a visitor. So managing all of that, the circulation logistics, I would say is the third important part.
That's a lot of information. To have to all the I think so many people in our industry, me included, work on a building or 12 at a time, but not a whole community where all the infrastructure and all the services and all the different types of things you need to design a community. There's thousands of details that you have to
Yes.
figure out. It's a little mind-blowing to be perfectly honest. So I love to ask this question when I'm talking to architects designing projects outside of the United States, because I've heard some really interesting stories. So it's a fun question to ask. So, how is it different from, say, New York compared to the Philippines? dealing with building code agencies and planning and approvals and things like that, uh, do you have to like completely educate yourself again? What does that process look like in the Philippines?
It's a great question, and it that does affect any international project. Um, I would answer the question in two ways. On one hand, at the macro level, in other words, seen from 30,000 feet, it it looks like it's not too different. Um, in the sense that a lot of the codes now have been standardized at an international level. A place like Philippines, for example, when it comes to seismic codes, because earthquakes are pretty important, have adopted codes that are very similar to a place like California. Um, and so they're kind of fashioned around codes that we would know. Uh, and when it comes to, let's say, building products that have to do with weather and climate, a place like the Philippines would not be too different from a place like Florida, where you have heat and you have hurricanes. And the building purveyors and building suppliers know that, and so they start to look at markets that are kind of related. But I think at the micro level, of course, there's lots of nuance and differences in terms of the processing and the different steps and the permitting. And this is why it's critical in any place to have local partners. There's no way we could do this remotely only by ourselves. You always, any place we go to, one of the critical questions is who do we collaborate with, and is that collaboration one that is productive and that we're happy with? Because if you don't, it's kind of it could be a disaster. Yeah.
I can only imagine. So another thing is I look at all these different pictures, at least from the pictures I can see. This looks like a rather remote location. Um, when it comes to things like infrastructure for power and water, um, skilled labor, all kinds of things pop into my head. Is this as remote as it looks? And how do you deal with getting those things in a place that maybe doesn't have any of it?
Mhm. Yes. Um, well, uh, gonna give you a two answer question again. Yes and no. So in the if you compare it to the grand scheme of level of remoteness in the Philippines, given that you have 7,000 islands in this archipelago in the Pacific, it's not as remote as you could get. There are places that are even harder, farther, and more challenging to build in that we're actually working on, and for other projects. But it's still, so it is 3 hours from the capital, which and it's accessible by road, and there is a highway, and so you can get building materials there. Having said that, there's a lot of challenges regarding utilities, water treatment, energy, um, uh, high speed internet, which are all important aspects to the functioning of the town. So we've had to bring in uh, consultants and engineers to essentially create a series of mini micro utility plants on the site to treat our own water, to handle our own energy, essentially to have a kind of redundancy, the planning for potential failures, because there are uh, local providers of water, energy, and other utility lines that you could rely on, but they're not entirely dependable. So in order to have this project viable, you basically have to design in resiliency, planning for potential uh, mishaps in that system. And so that has been a pretty important part of the project from an engineering point perspective. Yes. Yes.
So let's talk more about water. And it's funny because this is my second interview in 2 days on projects right by the water. So I heard some interesting things yesterday. Um, some of these buildings are literally right on the water or very close to the water. Um, I learned a bunch of new things yesterday, like plants matter with water. What were some of the special considerations, looking at water, high water table, hurricanes and typhoons? What are some of the special considerations you had to consider with the design of these buildings and this close relationship with the water?
Absolutely. Wow. Um, that's
That
a intense question because we could spend just an hour on water. Um, but let me maybe summarize it or try to cluster the answer into three parts. Stormwater management would be part number one. Number two is oceanfront development. The third would be on site surface water runoff. We knew right from the bat that uh, the site as it stands today gets flooded when there is a storm. Of course, it has to be an intense storm, but maybe every 10 years, about the first 20 feet, 30 feet of the site will experience flooding. When big waves come, and that can get more and more and more intense, and will get more and more intense because of all the factors that we're aware of. And so the first thing we did straight right away, before we even got into the architecture of any of the buildings, was a detailed regrading analysis and planning exercise, where we essentially, uh, through drone mapping, got a very uh, precise topographical um, contour map of both the site, the land site, but also what's called the bathymetry. I always mispronounce that word, but I think I pronounced it correct, which is essentially the topography of the water underneath. And so we got these amazing plans to 10 centimeters of a level of precision of all of the topography on site, but also all the topography underwater. And the first exercise was for us to begin to re-terrace the site, essentially to move and regrade the land so that we are controlling storm surge and managing storm water to its m- maximum minimum. In other words, as minimal of the site that we could be exposed to water flood. So right now we've basically brought it down to just the park promenade. So only in 100-year flood, only the recreation zones, which are the area where you might jog or you might push a stroller, is what would get exposed to a 100-year flood. But all of the buildings and anything with interior outfitting surfaces, the restaurant, and especially the homes, all of the residential are treated like sacred pieces that have been lifted uh, by about almost, if I'm not mistaken, about almost 4 meters, which is more than 10 feet. Which, just to put it in line, here in New York, after Hurricane Sandy, um, FEMA increased the 100-year flood line by, I think, about 8.5 feet, which is almost 3 meters. In other words, all of the structures along the waterfront in Manhattan, for example, this because actually my wife is an architect who specializes in, one of her specialties is flood management in New York, and she works for New York City EDC, and they do they do a lot of work with FEMA in terms of flood resiliency, is basically moving these buildings either up or moving their utility infrastructure up or protecting them. If you're a hospital, for example, there's a couple of hospitals, NYU and Bellevue Hospital, which are along the East River, which experienced massive flooding during Hurricane Sandy, and they've had to do a lot of work to get above that 9-foot line. So that's the first thing that we did. And now I realize that two other parts of the answer. The second one is oceanfront development. Basically means that any part of the building needs to be, and even the landscape, I think this is also what you're getting at, uh, is going to be exposed to a high degree of salt spray. And wind exposure and UV exposure because of the intensity of the sun, and that does extreme damage to buildings, and it's very harsh to certain plants. Certain plants work well because they were brought up and are native to this environment. But if you try to put something that doesn't work with that environment, it'll die. And the same with buildings, they will corrode. And so, in terms of the choice of materials, both hard and soft, has been uh, always guided by the principle of understanding that it will be exposed to that ocean environment, which is very specific and intense. And then the third is that in addition to the water coming from the ocean, which is salty water during a surge, you also have the rain, which is coming from the top, either in from the sky or from the mountains, because there actually are behind this site, there's some steep slopes that will bring runoff surface water down. So the other critical part of the design was creating a series of channels, culverts, waterways that ensured porosity and water movement and retention ponds throughout the project. So all of the buildings essentially sort of tiptoe and ballet around these canals, because the first thing that we designed were the canals. In fact, the architecture came second. It was the first move was the terraces and the canals. So really, it was the landscape first, and the architecture had to sort of play and adapt to itself, adapt to that design.
I now have dancing buildings in my head. Um, Describe for me in a little bit more detail some of the more unique site before we actually get to some buildings, but some of the more unique site or outdoor features you are designing for this project. Like what do I get to do outside when I go visit?
Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, so it's meant to be a place to be outside, and the clients were very also adamant and excited about ensuring a plethora of outdoor type of activities. So on the land side, there's all kinds of sports stuff that both active and passive, jogging paths, tennis courts, volleyball courts, um, paddle tennis, all for things like that are kind of integrated. In fact, one of the clients is a big tennis player, and we were able to uh, going back to this question about circulation, we were able to sneak in a 200 parking car garage to the site by slipping it into the mountain so you don't even see it, and utilizing the terraces. And above that garage are tennis courts. So when you drive down the hill, one of the first things you see are 6 tennis courts, and those tennis courts are really just the roof of a hidden parking garage that's kind of tucked into the mound. So there are all kinds of activities like that that are meant to be about an active, healthy lifestyle. Then, of course, there's water, and then the water activities are meant to be the real destination, the draw. So there is a right now, I think it's almost a 2 kilometer long waterfront park. And along that waterfront park, and it's like a promenade, are different outdoor amenities and activities, from more marina-based things like kayak launches, boat docks, things where you can literally go into the water with some sort of, uh, some sort of water-based vehicle, or more passive experiences with water, such as different floating pools. So there's sort of a partially salt pool, a salt fresh pool, a fresh pool in the water. sorry, in the built into the promenade, or what's called the embankment, and throughout that waterfront park, there's a pool club that's more sort of adults oriented. There's something like you might see in a place like Ibiza. Then there is, or Bali. Then there's more of a family oriented pool club that has um, uh, play equipment for the children a lot, and with a little school that's meant to also be a place where they can have outdoor classrooms and learn about how the water is being restored, because there's a big restoration in that bathymetry area that I mentioned, that the underwater, the project also is basically rebuilding the coral reefs and replanting the mangroves. So all of that waterfront ecological restoration is meant to be part of a kind of demonstration project for children and for teaching. And then there are other recreational things along the water, such as outdoor markets that are meant to be programmed uh, across a 7-day cycle. So maybe a pop-up market, craft, farmers market. So we designed an outdoor structure for that. There's there are a series of dining options. There are a couple of restaurants, ranging from places where you can shop in your flip-flops to more a bar. Uh, for to more of a sit down area with white tablecloths. So there's a range of eating places. And then there are two sort of iconic structures, um, which are the Yacht Club, that has a couple of stores, and it's not exclusive to just the Yacht Club members. There's a Yacht Club area that feels more like almost like an airline VIP lounge that would be for Yacht Club members. But up and below that, in other words, below and above that, is a outdoor promenade and a casual dining area for people along the promenade where they can just pick up sandwiches and eat outside looking at the boats. And then at the very, very tip of the marina, there's something we call a beacon. And that was also another idea from the client, to create a kind of vertical structure that stands out, that almost pays homage to lighthouses. These are all these important parts of marina towns across the world, even since Alexandria in Egypt. And it's meant to be a. I've always wanted to design one of these, and so we're finally designing one, which is a camera obscura. I don't know if you've heard of these things. They're very low tech medieval. Uh, they're really from the medieval period, which is just basically a black room with a little hole, and you can see the outside pictured on certain surfaces depending on how you design that little hole. So this beacon will actually have a couple of these camera obscuras where you, as you walk or take the elevator up, you can see the outside projected uh, uh, on the inside of a room. And then, of course, that beacon is illuminated at night and becomes kind of like a big monument and a landmark.
That I'm looking at the picture that has an elevator in it. I thought it was just like maybe some kind of sculptural structure,
It's
not something
it's
that.
really all it is just really an elevator with a stair that wraps around and a couple of decks. So it's the elevator is the main structure. It's basically that's the column of the building.
That is interesting. Um, so the yacht club sounds like it has a unique design. Tell me more about the design vision there with the yacht club.
The yacht club was really inspired by the shape of a wave, and so we looked a lot at how weights curl and how they create volume and space on the inside. And so the yacht club essentially kind of mimics this notion of a wave with these with a series of screens like slats and louvers. Um, uh, right now, we're considering a number of materials, of course, because of its oceanfront reality. We're sort of looking at durability of these, what the slats would be, whether they're composite, hybrid, bamboo, mass bamboo type of applications. And then on the inside of that screen, we have a series of ETFE panels, which are basically a a polymer that is non petroleum based, so it's um, it's it's a kind of ecoplastic, you might call it, that can be single ply or double ply. In other words, it can be like a pillow or it can be just like a sheet. And that's a translucent uh, material that allows the light in, but also is great for as to protect the structure from winds and rain. And so that is essentially the enclosure. And then on the inside, it's a combination of steel and concrete. As it changes from the lower area is reinforced concrete in order to stabilize it, ensure that in the event of any water exposure, it's protected. And then above that line is steel, also to lighten the structure.
Are there any other unique facilities on this site that you would like to highlight?
Well, I think the restaurant and Market Pool Club, which are little sort of cluster buildings right on the water, are all kind of interesting. And they all are related because of their formal similarity to a surfboard, you might say. So they've, although the first one that might appear very surfboard like is the restaurant. Very much, it's like a giant surfboard. But all the other, the pool club and the market are designed as agglomerations of surfboards. We were inspired by how sometimes when you go to the beach, you see a bunch of surfboards lined up along the rocks or the cliff, and how that that repetition of that shape could become a vertical element, almost like a column. So in the pool club and the market, we essentially use that shape as the column. It's a mix between a steel member in the middle of the surfboard, what sometimes in surfboard language is called a stringer, which is like the wood piece. And then around that is glass reinforced concrete to make it a lighter element. Um, and then that holds together a series of shapeboard looking canopies, which are built in a combination of steel as the edge beam with ETFE panels or ETFE fabrics, single ply, not the double ply like in the rest or in the in the yacht club, because single ply is less expensive. It's also uh, quite well suited if you're not doing a curved surface, but you're just doing something that's a single curvature, so it's not a complex curve. And in the pool club and in the market, they're pretty simple roofs. So that's where we're using the ETFE, and that's almost like a kind of tent structure that's stretched in tensegrity or like in tension.
Am I imagining it, or is the pool in the shape of a sail on a sailboat?
Yes,
Or
true.
is that my interpretation?
That's I love that interpretation. I think that we going back and forth. We definitely in on our mood board for the project. There's sailboats, there are waves, and there are surfboards and kayaks. So we're essentially always looking at ocean related structures. In addition to, I have to confess, also ocean organisms. A lot of our design um, inspiration was also looking at uh, pictures from scuba divers, what they see underwater. So we looked at, maybe some of the structures might even look a little bit like sea anemones or one of my favorite ones that we found were called nudie branches, which are these little sea sponges, super colorful, beautiful. If you look them online, and they're sometimes about 6 or 8 inches long, but they look like these extraterrestrial sea things, that incredible shapes and colors, beautiful. So we were definitely inspired by all of those ocean related things. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad I'm not imagining things. Um, so you've mentioned some of your building materials here and there as we've been talking. I have worked on projects before, so I am very aware of what salt water can do to building materials. What are some of the more common materials you're planning to use throughout this community?
It's a great question. So, you know, we first of all, as mentioned, the ocean reality is top of mind and was the first sort of decision making criteria to be able to determine whether a material is viable or not. That's how we are able to edit out yes or no. But then the other thing that was very important in choosing materials was to determine whether uh, it's going to be exposed or not to water, um, potential water, and what kind of water. So he looked at the degree of exposure that might have to ocean water, the degree of exposure might have to fresh water due to the rain, and then those areas that maybe will have very limited exposure. So he sort of graded the project based on that. And then the other important design criteria is, given that we not only did the urban design for the whole town, but we're designing all the buildings, from the residential to these communal amenities. We have to have a palette that is consistent, but not repetitive and monotonous. So that was also really important. And trying to find, a a material, uh, let's say, menu that can tie the whole thing together so they do feel like there is consistency. And when you look at the images, it's like, oh, these are family of buildings that are all related, but they're not the same. And we don't want every building to look like the next one either. So that was probably one of the biggest design challenges, is to create this family of forms that are related, like in a family of humans. That, okay, I see your cousin, I see your sister, you guys have similar traits, but you're not the same.
Right.
So that was that. So we looked at, for example, from a structural point of view, uh, we ended up zeroing in on a hybrid structure of reinforced concrete steel, um, with occasional use of mass bamboo on the interior. Again, that had to do with exposure to water. Anything that utilizes glue, such as cross-laminated timber, there was concern that it might not really do well over a long period of time when exposed to these elements. So when we utilize that material, it's on the inside. Like in the restaurant, for example, we transition from concrete at a certain level, from 0 to, let's say, 6 feet, and then steel, and then for the roof beams, uh, mass bamboo. There's an amazing company that we discovered is the first one of the pioneers of mass bamboo in the world, and they're actually based in the Philippines. They have a 5,000 hectare farm of the largest bamboos of the world, and they are a vertically integrated company that they do all their own farming, their own milling, their own fabrication, and then they deliver these things. So that was the structural side. And then from the cladding, we, at some point had considered some more natural material, but ultimately we really had to do composites because of the degree of exposure. So we have, ecoplastic, um, louvers and battens that mimic the look of, let's say, bamboo or wood screen for the sheathing. We have expanded metal, which is very pliable type of metal. It's also quite affordable. It stretches. You could customize the openings that have this sort of diamond shape, and it can be powder coated with several layers of factory applied paint that is ocean grade. So in fact, it's used a lot in boats. So we really had to always put the ocean environment at uh, front and center in the choice of materials. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So I couldn't get a good read when I was digging around on the internet. Has any of this been built yet? And what is the schedule? for construction. When is it going to be ready for me?
Trust me, I get so many friends asking me the same question. So they are doing construction as we speak, uh, but it is the civil works. In other words, utilities, roads, retaining walls, regrading, all that first design stuff that I mentioned before the buildings. The buildings most likely won't begin construction until next year, perhaps third quarter of next year, third to fourth quarter of next year, because there's considerable amount of civil works that has to put into place. But we're working on all of the construction documents and all of the engineering in order for it to be sort of shovel ready once the site is ready. But because the site is as you've noticed, it's quite remote, and as you noted, it's still also quite vegetated. There it has to be done with some sort of degree of care and caution. Yeah.
I'm curious because your firm is rather different than most firms that I see on a daily basis. What is your firm's ethos or mission? What do you want to be known for?
Oh wow. It's a tough one. I mean, I would say to design places that help us um pay attention to our world in a more acute and better way. And I've become convinced that there is a war on attention. There's a battle for people's attention everywhere, and technology, of course, is great, but it also, has a dominating force on people's attention. And I think as architects, we have a role in creating places that help us, whether it's paying attention in school or paying attention in a hospital if you're in a healthcare environment, or paying attention to nature if you're in a place like this where you're trying to, reconnect with certain things and spend time in family and be outdoors. Those are different stages and forms of attention, but I think architecture can assist and help us and aid in that quest.
I love that. I go on an annual Mother's Day weekend trip with with my kids and their partners and a whole bunch of family. And we go to a place that's by a mountain lake where there is no service. And so we spend 4 days and nobody has a phone or a tablet or a TV. And all we do is even the lake doesn't allow motorboats, only rowboats or kayaks.
Oh
And
wow.
yeah, and we go up there together and everybody goes like the first 6 or 8 hours, everybody's going through withdrawal. Oh, hey, I'll go Google that. Then they remember, oh, I can't go Google that, just in conversation. And then once they get past the withdrawal phase, you start remembering how to pay attention again. And I don't think that we realize how much of that we've lost
Hmm.
until you force yourself to go take it away for a while. I forgot my
Oh yeah.
phone at home the other day. I was going to a winery with a friend and forgot my phone. And for a couple hours, I felt like I was missing my right arm. And then I realized actually I'm having a really lovely time. And there's not that thing in your head saying, I want to go look at my phone or I'm going to go look this up. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so
I first thought I've always been feeling this, but I not until about a year ago did it really crystallize in my head. And it actually was through a podcast that I was I was listening to a podcast of, I'm sure you know this gentleman, Ezra Klein.
mhm.
He was interviewing a historian of science who had just written a book and I guess teaches a class at Princeton on attention and how, this is not a new thing, and how we have, how companies have studied for decades how to tap into our attention, whether it's through TV, radio before that, of course now, social media. But it's not a new thing, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated about how it's structured and how our brain works. and his the podcast, I just like blew my mind. I mean, we realized this is a real thing that we got to be thinking about at a kind of you know quantum level for civilization, as that our society. So we gotta, I think architects play a role in that.
I couldn't agree with you more. Just look at some of the politics in the United States right now,
Mhm.
and how much the internet and things are influencing people rather than people doing their own homework. It's
Yeah.
a little scary.
Hmm.
So I love anything that takes your attention back to things that are good about this world, and not other places. So just last month, you, along with a couple of other people, came out with a book titled "The Metabolism of Settlement Coexistences." Tell me about that.
Oh, thank you for asking. So yeah, that book actually just arrived here about a week ago. I hadn't seen a real copy. Um, s- uh, it is a book that develops and shares a series of tools to study how our communities um, metabolize nature, put it that way. So, bringing it to the architect's scale, I think nowadays most architects probably will agree that we can understand our buildings as metabolic machines. In other words, our buildings process water, they take in, they pump out the water in different ways, whether it's gray water, they clean water, They also consume energy, and we can measure how much energy they use, uh, either whether it's the carbon footprint of the building materials or the actual consumption of the energy over the course of the year. So that can be measured, and the same can be measured in terms of their the amount of matter that they use. So we could do that at the building scale, and I think people this is not news to most people nowadays in the architecture world. What we try to do is scale that up to the communities, to the level of a community. So we look at in the book we first of all we developed this tool that's essentially based off Sankey diagram. Sankey diagram is a diagram just analyzes flows. It was put together by a Scottish engineer who looked in the 18th century at how a steam engine works, what flows go into a steam engine and what flows go out. So we take that same idea, same visualizing uh, tool to think about what goes into a settlement and what comes out: the water, the energy, the waste, and the matter. And we looked at four different types of what we call human settlements, which are community types. We look at a urban core in Paris, traditional urban, center in somewhere in the center of Paris. We look at an American suburb. So we look at an area outside of Boston, along Route 128, and we looked at a informal community in the developing world, which is we looked at an informal settlement outside of Monterrey, Mexico, which is one of the bigger industrial cities in Mexico. And then we looked at what are called geographers called Desakota regions, which are emerging more and more around the world, but they're very common in Asia, where Desakota is a Indonesian term to describe a patchwork between rural and urban. And you see this a lot in places like China, Indonesia, actually Philippines too, where you go out to the areas periphery of the city, and it's not clearly a suburb, it's not a city, but neither is it agricultural. It's a mix. You'll have a little bit of rice paddies, and then you'll have a couple of buildings, then you have some strip malls, and you have more rice paddies, and it's this strange, like sort of halfway type urbanism. So we looked at that, and we kind of compared them and see, what's how do they rate, and how can you rank them in terms of their use of water, energy, waste, how do they manage it, and matter. And so the idea is that we could begin to index and analyze and study our communities, and apply this thinking at the human settlement scale and begin to say, well, is our community really green or not green? How do we get better? How do we utilize water better? And this is quantitative, so it's science based, and it gives us real data um, about how we're doing at a community level beyond just the building scale.
I don't know where you find time to do all of these things. I know I'll be needing an autographed copy.
Oh,
So
definitely.
just
I
put
I
that
will
on your
send one over.
list.
Yes.
What would you say so far? Obviously, this project is a phased project, so you're nowhere near finished. But so far, what would you say has been your biggest lesson learned from this particular project that is making you a better architect on the next project?
Oh, wow. Um, d- Details matter. Um, Even at a big project like this, where there's so many complex moving parts, and it seems like it's about the big moves, uh, ultimately where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is at the detail scale. And so where you make the resolutions and where you bring in the, the design intelligence is at the detail scale, both I mean that at the building scale in terms of how a building lands or how a building facade works, but also at a urban and landscape scale in terms of how are we treating the transition between a canal, a pedestrian sidewalk, and the entry to a villa or to a house. And I think all of those little details and transitions say a lot. And so, for example, in this project, one of the things that the which really wanted to avoid was walls. We didn't want to to create any gates, any enclosures, any hard boundaries between places. But at the same time, you need to deal with privacy. And so this is a public town. People can arrive and park in the parking lot and walk to the. So how do you manage the boundary between a house and the public space without putting a wall in the gate? I mean, I think there are many ways you can do it with landscape hedges and with a water separation that cues people like, oh, that's not I shouldn't go there. That's not a public space. I shouldn't walk here, without having to be really too rough and exact. But that just has to do with spending time designing the details.
Before we get to our two closing questions, tell me what else is CAZA working on that I get to call you later and have you back because you will now never escape me. Um, what else is your firm working on that you'd like us all to know about?
Oh, well, let's see. I mean, in the region, we're working on a couple of very exciting, like hospitality projects in remote islands in the sort of Southeast Asia region. But outside of the region, uh, we're working. I would say maybe four interesting things. We're working on a very interesting community center in the Bronx here in New York. Uh, um, that's a space for the community to have events, but also for local schools to have a sports venue. There are a lot of local schools in the Bronx, in this area in the Bronx, that don't have places for the kids to play basketball and play volleyball and that kind of thing. So like a gymnasium slash community center. We're working on a very interesting sort of adult wellness retreat in Colombia, South America, outside of Bogota. We're working on a hospital in the Middle East that is in geared towards regenerative medicine and non-invasive ways of of helping our body heal through stem cells and all different kinds. This is way above my understanding, but these are some of the most progressive doctors who have pioneered ways without having to go through surgery to help athletes, and some of the biggest pro athletes recuperate, and they're now sort of bringing that knowledge to the greater public. So those are, and then we're also doing a kind of a this last one, uh, actually going back and wrapping back to the Philippines, we're doing a very interesting in Manila, in the center of the city, a 1 kilometer long park that is the center of a big new commercial district, but we're primarily doing the park. So the park is like this green space that connects a train station with another transport hub and connects a series of blocks with all these sort of mixed use commercial district around it. But really, we're designing this park space.
Well, I'm glad you're going to have plenty to talk to me about. So I always close every interview with two questions, one being a broader industry question, and then my final question that I force everybody to answer. I twist their arm. Your website talks about using data-driven studies, research, and quantitative analysis for your projects. What advice can you give to other architects about a more analytical process for project planning?
That's a great, yeah. A lot of people sometimes ask, what is this really? What do you mean by data-driven design? To put it in a really dumb way, what I believe is being an expert is sometimes detrimental to design, and that we should approach every project a little bit like a beginner. Of course, that I don't mean to be naive about that either, but in terms of walking into a room or walking into a site or walking in and meeting a client and assuming you know nothing and collecting as much data as you can about them, about the place, about all the other parameters that will affect your project, and being as kind of voracious and omnivorous as you can about that data collection, not leaving um, any stone unturned, but also just nowadays, frankly, there's so much data you can get on any project, any site, any client, that it could be overwhelming. But allowing that early fishing expedition to be very rich and, let's say, fecund in terms of fertile, and just and then sifting to that and not having precepts yet, and allowing some of this data to drive your insights, and what the sort of connections you see. So this is a sort of loose period where you're analyzing it, and of course balancing it on things that you already know, what the clients are asking for, what the stakeholders are telling you is critical to the project, but also listening to those the numbers to drive a design. Because I think design can be a form of thinking, but if it's unfettered from a kind of stylistic requirement that it has to look in a particular way or has to be a particular thing. I think if you say that we don't really know yet, and leaving that open allows that data-driven process to be facilitated and to be a creative one. Yeah.
I have a more analytical brain. There's no right brain. There's no creativity in here at all. I don't think sometimes, but I'm not a designer. I'm not an architect, but I have seen over the years sometimes something being designed and thought to myself, does the data support that? Is that really what this space and these users in this place need? Because sometimes you could look right at it and go, I don't know. I think that's really great advice, because I think that could also promote efficiency once you have that, and stepping off on the right foot with your design in the first place. And maybe not having to go through 85,000 I lost the word that was in my head. Iterations. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
To get to where you need to go, maybe you could do a lot less of that if you really know those needs before you go in. So I love that answer, and it's great advice. Final question, easiest question of the day. I could tell you already don't trust me. Uh, I truly, and I mean this when I say it, I truly hope that we all as human beings try to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. So it doesn't have to be one thing, just pick one that's important, but personal or professional. What do you hope your individual impact will be?
I've been interested in this topic of beauty, um, and it's beauty is a very slippery term, and I don't talk about it because as soon as you say it, people have so many different reactions to it, and it's all over the board. Um, and and it could be like cosmetic beauty, classical beauty. What you mean about beauty is like, wow, this is don't even begin open that Pandora's box. But I'm interested because of my background in philosophy. I'm interested about how philosophers have talked about beauty as having this ability to kind of awaken your senses as a human, and 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 many philosophers also talk about it not just as a self um, awareness or a sort of something about self actualization, but it also has to do with you connecting with the world and connecting with your people and people around you and becoming just more here and more there. And I think that in a sort of hopeful way, if one could think about architecture or design as a cautious, slow discipline where we're building things that we hope will have a positive impact. That positivity many times comes from beauty and how beauty can make people stop and think and look and maybe listen and maybe pay attention. All of those together. I know it sounds very sort of warm and fuzzy and hard to pin down, but there is, there's been a lot of research into this in terms of even from a scientific point of view, how awe in people inspires, better ability to be aware of their environment and to be better actually to listen to people in the community. So I think yeah, that would be hopefully a contribution that some of these structures somewhere in the world maybe allow, enable us to experience this little burst of joy, which is what beauty is. And through that burst of joy, focus on each other in or on our place or on what we're seeing in more heightened, authentic way.
Well, I'll tell you, those warm fuzzies are where all of the most important things in our lives live. So don't ever feel like you have to defend a warm fuzzy. Um,
Okay. Thank
because
you.
truly, I think so many people get so caught up in what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to be, how things are expected to be,
Mm.
rather than just digging deep in being who you are and designing, something that like truly fits where it needs to be, not somebody's vision of the box that thing is supposed to fit in. Wherever you want to throw a warm fuzzy in, that's that's the secret sauce. That's what actually makes, whether it's that person or that building or whatever it is, that's what makes it special and notable and inviting. So you just keep up all of that, because
Thank you.
seriously, Carlos, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been the most amazing interview. I could spend hours talking to you about. So you have to come back on the show, because I'm going to want to hear. I had already known about a couple of those other projects you're mentioning because I trolled you online, but I'm going to want to hear about some of those. I couldn't appreciate this morning more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cherise. It's been such a joy. Great conversation. This is